An empty house. No cars in the driveway. No lights coming on and off in any regular pattern. No mail accumulating in the box. No sound. No movement. No sign that anyone had been inside in weeks. That is what the neighbors saw. That is what anyone driving past would have seen. That is not what federal agents found when they breached the door. What they found inside a property directly linked to Tomasso Cioni, Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, the man who drove her home the night of January 31st, and whose car was the last one she rode in as a free woman, was described by trained tactical personnel as deeply disturbing. Not concerning, not significant. Disturbing. These are professionals who enter the worst scenes law enforcement encounters. People whose threshold for what qualifies as shocking has been calibrated by years of exposure to criminal evidence that would devastate an untrained civilian. They entered that house prepared for what they expected to find. What they found was not what they expected. 3 categories of evidence. A covert surveillance network that exceeded anything required for a single abduction. Personal belongings with no connection to Tomasso Cioni or to any individual with a legal claim to the property, now in the custody of the Federal Forensic Laboratory. And physical traces of organized, systematic, repeated activity in a house that from the outside showed no sign of life. This video covers every confirmed detail of what happened when federal agents entered that property. What it means for the investigation, what it means for the case against Tomasso Cioni, and what it tells us, after 72 days of silence, about the true scope of what was done to Nancy Guthrie. The investigation had been building toward this moment for weeks. They found it. Stay with me all the way through. Family. Before I take you through every detail of what federal agents discovered inside that empty house, before I walk you through the surveillance infrastructure, the personal belongings, the organized activity that a tactical unit found inside a property that, from the outside, showed no sign of life, we stop. Because at the center of all of this is a real woman, an 84-year-old mother and grandmother who spent the last normal evening of her life at her daughter Annie's house. Dinner. A game. Tomasso Cioni drove her home. The garage door closed at 9:50 p.m., and now, weeks into a federal investigation that has produced tunnels, interrogations, surveillance logs, hidden cameras, gas station footage, and a 19-hour interrogation, investigators have entered a second property tied to the man who drove her home that night. And what they found inside has disturbed trained tactical personnel, whose professional threshold is the worst evidence law enforcement encounters. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. Everything in this video comes from confirmed sourced reporting by investigators and individuals with direct knowledge of the operation. Where official confirmation is pending, that is clearly stated. Let's pray. Lord, for Nancy, for Savannah, for Annie, for every member of this family that has been carrying 72 days of silence, for the federal agents who stormed that property and are now processing what they found, for the forensic laboratory working to determine what those personal belongings reveal about Nancy's fate after February 1st Street, for truth, for justice, for Nancy's return. Amen. Type Amen for Nancy. Where are you watching from? Country and city. Drop it below. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the charges come, when the names are filed, you want to be in this room. Let's go through every detail. It started with an empty house, a property directly linked to Tomasso Cioni, not his primary residence. An uninhabited house, a place whose vacancy was common knowledge among the neighbors who described it to local media as having sat empty for a period of several weeks. No vehicles parked in the driveway on any regular basis. No lights turning on and off in the patterns of an occupied home. No mail piling up in the mailbox. No signs of the everyday rhythms that mark a lived-in space. To any neighbor walking past, it was a dead building. Unremarkable. Forgettable. The kind of structure that stops registering on the active memory of a neighborhood because nothing about it demands attention. Oh. That invisibility was not accidental. That was the point. Because what investigators had already established, through weeks of surveillance, through the intelligence generated by tunnels and interrogation logs and hidden camera discoveries and gas station footage, pointed directly at this property, not as an abandoned building, as an active node in a criminal infrastructure whose geographic footprint was proving far larger than the original investigation had projected. Why they sent a tactical team, not standard agents. This detail carries significant weight, and it needs to be understood clearly. The decision to deploy a special tactical unit rather than standard field agents to execute a search of a property is not routine. It is not a precautionary default. It is a determination made by senior investigators who have reviewed the intelligence on a specific location and concluded that what is likely inside exceeds the operational preparedness of regular personnel. You send tactical forces when you believe the situation requires it. When the intelligence says the property holds something that demands a different level of entry. When the risk assessment, based on what has already been found elsewhere in the investigation, says that this location warrants the highest readiness response available. Federal investigators looked at what they knew about this property. They looked at its connection to Tomasso Cioni. They looked at what the prior weeks of evidence had revealed about the architecture of this crime. And they determined that a standard search warrant execution was not the appropriate response. They sent the tactical team. And when the tactical team crossed that threshold, what they found confirmed that the deployment decision had been exactly right. What an operational blind spot looks like. Before we go into what was found, it is worth understanding exactly what a property like this represents in the framework of a complex criminal operation. A property that appears abandoned while serving an active function is not a hiding place in the simple sense. It is a logistical node, a strategic component in a distributed infrastructure whose strength lies precisely in its ability to disappear from public awareness. Neighbors walk past. They see a lifeless structure. Superficial observation reveals no human trace. Utility records, if anyone thought to look, might show residual consumption consistent with genuine vacancy. The building blends into its surroundings so completely that it stops registering as significant. That is how this type of site operates. Not by being hidden, by being so unremarkable that no one thinks to question what it holds. The federal investigation managed to see past that facade. 3 weeks of surveillance on Tomasso Cioni had documented his repeated and systematic visits to this location. His presence at this secondary property was not occasional or explainable by routine activity. It was documented, regular, purposeful, and it was the thread that led investigators from the first site to this one. The trail that had been building for weeks, through interrogation, through forensic analysis, through the documentation of Cioni's movements, led here. And when they entered, the trail delivered what it had been promising. The exact details of what was found inside the abandoned house have not been officially disclosed by authorities in their raw form. What has emerged comes from direct witnesses to the operation. People with first-hand knowledge of what the tactical team encountered when they breached that door and secured the perimeter. What they found falls into 3 distinct categories. Each one on its own would be significant. Together, their combined weight is what produced that word. Disturbing. Category 1. Organized activity in a house that was supposed to be empty. The property was not functioning as a traditional home. But the forensic team that entered did not find the scattered, deteriorating remnants of genuine abandonment. What they found was organized, methodical, deliberate. Physical traces of activity distributed throughout the interior, following a logic that the forensic team began documenting the moment the area was declared secure. That detail, the organized, deliberate arrangement of what was inside, was the first thing that told agents they were not looking at the remnants of ordinary life. They were looking at something purposeful, something maintained, something that had been arranged not by chance but by intent. The almost systematic organization of the evidence was the first key to understanding what this property actually was. Seeing that everything had been meticulously ordered, not scattered haphazardly, not dumped randomly, told agents immediately that they were dealing with criminal minds operating with surgical precision. This was not a dump site. This was not a temporary refuge improvised in a moment of panic. This was an operational location that had been managed with the same deliberate discipline that had characterized every other element of this crime. Category 2. A covert surveillance infrastructure. This is the finding that produced the most profound forensic shift in the investigation. In direct parallel with the hidden lens found in Nancy Guthrie's own residence, the abandoned property housed a sophisticated surveillance network. Not a single device. A complete, installed, maintained network of surveillance equipment. The technological arsenal discovered inside displayed a level of sophistication and operational reach that far exceeded what would be required for the abduction of a single 84-year-old woman from her home. Let that land for a moment. The equipment was more comprehensive than the crime investigators were already investigating would require, which means it was not installed solely for Nancy Guthrie. That distinction is the axis around which the second category of findings rotates, and it is what produced the darkest implication of the entire discovery. A hidden camera in a victim's home is a focused, surgical intelligence tool, installed with a specific objective, criminal purpose directly tied to a single act. Its utility is limited by the target and the nature of the crime. But multiple devices inside a vacant property, with no ties to known victims, maintained over an extended period, installed as a network rather than a single asset, belong to an entirely different category. That is the machinery of an uninterrupted surveillance operation. A technical capability conceived not for isolated use but to serve a constant, systematic, ongoing function. A program, organized, funded, persistent, to monitor individuals who have no knowledge their lives are being watched. If that house was the operations base from which the interior of Nancy Guthrie's private residence was being monitored, it was precisely there that those responsible sat and watched her every movement. It was there that they dissected her routines. It was there that they determined that February 1st was the exact moment the intelligence they had gathered dictated the operation must execute. And if the surveillance infrastructure exceeded the requirements of a single abduction, this property may be the origin point for other surveillance operations against individuals whose names do not yet appear in the official case file of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. That is not a definitive conclusion. It is the forensic question the technological network is forcing the federal team to resolve. Category 3. Personal belongings with no connection to Tomasso Cioni. This is the category on which sources have been most careful. The language used by those familiar with the operation has been deliberate and precise, suggesting what was found without yet confirming its exact nature. Personal effects. Belongings and objects with no connection to Tomasso Cioni. No connection to any individual with a legal claim to the property. Items belonging to someone who was there, or was brought to that location, or whose possessions ended up there when that person no longer had the capacity to keep them themselves. The precise nature of those objects remains under a tight official seal. What has been confirmed is this: belongings with no ties to Tomasso Cioni, or to any documented individual connected to the property, were found inside that empty house. And their discovery is what produced the finding that the tactical team described as truly disturbing. Those items are currently in the custody of the Federal Forensic Laboratory. Examinations are underway to determine who they belong to, how they ended up in that property, and what they reveal about the fate of Nancy Guthrie after February 1st. Whether any of those personal items have been forensically linked to Nancy Guthrie through DNA, through fingerprints, through trace evidence, has not yet been officially confirmed. But that is precisely what federal forensic analysts are working to determine right now. Every new discovery in this investigation has done the same thing. It has pushed the timeline back. The tunnel. Earlier than anyone expected, the surveillance infrastructure inside Nancy's home, installed before the night of February 1st. The documentation of Tomasso Cioni's movements across secondary locations, established over weeks, which means they began weeks before investigators first identified them. And now, this property. A property managed over an extended period does not appear overnight. Before the administration of that site began, before someone began making systematic, documented returns to maintain its operational readiness, the property had to be established, acquired, prepared. And before any of that, it had to be selected. Choosing a secondary operational location is a strategic decision. It is made not in the days before a crime is executed. It is made in the embryonic stages of the planning process, when the infrastructure is being laid out, when the geographic footprint is being determined, when every node in the logistical network is being identified and secured. Which means this property was selected before the surveillance infrastructure was installed inside it, before the first hidden camera was placed in Nancy Guthrie's home, before February 1st, before any evidence of this crime had been detectable to anyone who was not planning it. The abandoned house pushes the origin of this crime further back than any prior discovery has established. It is evidence that what was done to Nancy Guthrie was not planned in weeks. It was planned over a period whose true beginning has not yet been fully determined. And that has direct implications for the legal case being constructed around Tomasso Cioni. Because a crime this extensively pre-planned, distributed across multiple geographic locations, requiring the acquisition and preparation of secondary operational sites, is not the work of someone who made a sudden decision. It is the work of someone who was building toward this for a very long time. Stop right here. You have just heard the three categories of what federal agents found inside that empty house: the organized activity, the covert surveillance network that exceeded the requirements of a single abduction, the personal belongings with no connection to Tomasso Cioni, now in federal forensic custody. What comes next is the part of this that the investigation is still working to process. You are about to hear what the administrative management of that property, the documented, systematic, repeated visits, means for the evidentiary case against Tomasso Cioni, what the 19-hour interrogation may have revealed about this location, how the first secondary site led investigators here, and what the combined forensic picture, from the first breach to this one, is building toward in terms of federal charges. You are going to hear what the neighbors saw, what they did not know, and what they woke up to when federal vehicles surrounded their street. And you are going to hear what the full scope of this investigation now looks like, and why investigators are saying the true architecture of this crime has not yet been fully mapped. Subscribe, so that when charges are filed, when names are formally attached to what was found in that house, you are in this room. Like, because Nancy's name needs to stay at the center of this investigation. Share, because someone watching this may have seen something near that property that they do not realize matters. Type subscribed. We keep going. The empty house did not emerge from nowhere in the investigation. It was found through a chain of evidence that began at the first secondary site and ran through one of the most significant interrogation events of the entire federal investigation. 19 hours. That is the duration of the interrogation that preceded the identification of this property as the next point of entry for the case. 19 hours of questioning that generated the kind of intelligence that moves an investigation from one geographic location to another. That turns a thread into a trail. That takes what was known about Tomasso Cioni's connection to secondary locations and adds the specific coordinates of where that trail leads next. Oh, the leads found at the first property led investigators here. That is the sequential logic of how complex criminal investigations expand. Not randomly, not through luck, but through the disciplined following of threads that the evidence generates. It may have been a direct revelation during the interrogation, a location named, described, placed on a map by someone who had run out of other options for what to say during 19 hours of questioning. Or it may have been the forensic analysis of evidence from the first site that pointed toward this one. Digital records, communications patterns, materials whose origin or destination traced back to the abandoned house. Both are possible. Both are consistent with how this level of federal investigation operates. What is confirmed is the result. Investigators had a specific property. They had it tied to Tomasso Cioni through 3 weeks of documented surveillance. They had the probable cause foundation to obtain a search warrant. And they had intelligence specific enough to justify sending a tactical team rather than standard agents. 3 weeks of surveillance on Cioni confirmed his repeated and systematic visits to this location. Not occasional. Not explainable by routine activity. Systematic, the kind of documented movement pattern that, once established, changes the legal status of a property from peripheral to central. That documentation, combined with what the interrogation revealed, gave investigators everything they needed to breach that door with a tactical unit and process what they found as evidence in the federal case. What the first site revealed: the abandoned house is an entirely separate property from the first secondary site. It represents a second node, a second point of interest tied to Tomasso Cioni, in what the evidence is increasingly characterizing as a distributed criminal infrastructure. The network involved more than one operative. The timeline extended far beyond what had initially been established. The sophistication of the plan surpassed anything that external surveillance could have detected in the early stages. All of the logistics, the hideouts, the personnel, the technical devices the operation required, were dispersed across multiple geographic locations, completely shattering the initial geometry that the crime scene had suggested to investigators when this case began. That is the recurring pattern in this investigation. Every new discovery reveals that what was already known was only a fraction of what existed. The tunnel was not a simple access point. It was part of something larger. The surveillance network inside Nancy's home was not an isolated device. It was connected to an operational infrastructure housed in other locations. The abandoned house is the next node, the new frontier claimed by the federal investigation. And what it was hiding inside is the confirmation that the true scope of this conspiracy has not yet been fully mapped. Let me be precise about what the discovery inside the abandoned house means legally for Tomasso Cioni, because this is the part of the investigation that requires the most careful analysis. The link between Tomasso Cioni and the empty house now constitutes a fundamental evidentiary connection in the federal case. It was established through 3 weeks of surveillance that documented his systematic presence at that location. It was built on the investigative work that followed the first secondary site. It was confirmed by what emerged from the 19-hour interrogation, and it produced the probable cause foundation that authorized the tactical entry. What was found inside that property, the surveillance network, the personal belongings, the evidence of organized ongoing activity, is now part of the evidence file that federal prosecutors are analyzing alongside the totality of everything this investigation has accumulated. That analysis will determine what specific charges the evidence supports. That determination has not yet been officially communicated to the public. What sources have indicated is this: the contents of the empty house have considerably strengthened the evidentiary foundation of the case. They have introduced categories of evidence that were not previously part of the documented record, and they have done so in a way that expands rather than complicates the picture the investigation has been building. What the evidentiary picture now looks like. Step back and consider the full arc of what the investigation has established. The timeline of January 31st and February 1st. The 1:44 a.m. phone call, made 3 minutes before the camera was disabled, from a private number, to the woman who had been at dinner with Tomasso Cioni hours earlier. The 9:50 p.m. garage door closing. The pacemaker recording 41 minutes of distress, and then going silent at 2:28 a.m. The hidden camera in Nancy Guthrie's home. The focused surveillance tool installed with a specific criminal purpose targeting a specific individual. The tunnel. Evidence of infrastructure planning that predated February 1st by a significant period. 3 weeks of documented surveillance establishing Cioni's systematic visits to the first secondary location. The 19-hour interrogation and the intelligence it generated. And now, the abandoned house. The surveillance network that exceeded a single crime's requirements. The personal belongings in federal forensic custody. The organized activity in a property that showed no outward sign of life. That is not a collection of isolated findings. That is an evidentiary architecture. Each discovery connects to the others. Each new finding extends the reach of what the investigation can demonstrate. And each extension pushes the timeline further back, establishing not just what happened on the night of February 1st, but how long this was being planned, and what infrastructure was built to execute it. Federal prosecutors analyzing that architecture against the standard of charges that can be proven beyond reasonable doubt are making determinations that have not yet been publicly announced. What the evidence strongly suggests, and what sources close to the investigation have indicated, is that those determinations are advancing. What remains officially unconfirmed? Formal confirmation is still pending on several specific questions: whether an arrest warrant has already been issued, or whether new federal charges are being prepared based on the findings in the abandoned house against Tomasso Cioni or any other individual identified following the forensic examination of that property. Whether the uninhabited residence has been formally declared a secondary crime scene in connection with the federal investigation into the Nancy Guthrie case. And, the most significant pending question of all, whether any of the personal items recovered at the abandoned property have been forensically linked to Nancy Guthrie. Through DNA, through fingerprints, through trace evidence matching the reference profile stored in the Federal Investigations Database, those determinations are being made in the Federal Forensic Laboratory right now. The answers, when they come, will define the next phase of this case. The second category of findings inside the abandoned house demands its own full treatment, because the surveillance infrastructure discovered at that property is not just significant in the context of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. It raises a question that the federal team is now being forced to investigate. Was Nancy Guthrie the only target? Let me explain why that question is now part of the active federal inquiry. A hidden camera in a victim's home is a surgical tool. It is installed with a specific objective: to monitor a specific individual in service of a specific criminal plan. Its operational utility begins and ends with that one target. The surveillance network found in the abandoned house is not that. Multiple devices, a comprehensive, installed, maintained infrastructure, a level of sophistication that, in the assessment of federal agents who processed the scene, exceeded what would be required for the surveillance and abduction of a single individual, even in a complex, pre-planned operation like the one that was executed against Nancy Guthrie. Oh, when your surveillance capability exceeds the requirements of the crime you are already investigating, the logical forensic question becomes, what else was it being used for? A property functioning as a monitoring center, housing surveillance equipment that runs beyond the scope of a single abduction, is not the infrastructure of a one-time crime. It is the infrastructure of an ongoing program, an organized, funded, maintained capability to watch people who have no knowledge they are being watched. And that capability, by definition, could have been directed at individuals whose names do not yet appear in the official case file of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. What this means for the scope of the federal case. The federal team that entered that abandoned house did not exit with a cleaner, more contained picture of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. They exited with a significantly larger, more complex, and more disturbing picture of the criminal enterprise the investigation had uncovered. The discovery that the surveillance infrastructure exceeded the requirements of a single crime is what forced an immediate reallocation of all investigative resources when the property was processed. The body of evidence grew exponentially in a way that no prior finding had produced. Sources familiar with the operation describe the forensic shift as drastic, not incremental, not an extension of what was already known, but a categorical expansion that introduced questions the investigation had not previously been positioned to answer. The sophistication of the plan was already beyond what external surveillance had detected in the early stages. The network already involved more than one operative. The timeline had already been pushed further back than the original crime scene suggested. The abandoned house confirmed that the true scope of the conspiracy against Nancy Guthrie has not yet been fully mapped, and it introduced the possibility that what was built to take Nancy, the infrastructure, the personnel, the surveillance capability, may have been built for something larger than Nancy. That possibility is now part of what federal investigators are pursuing. For weeks, the neighbors of the empty house had no idea. They walked past its walls every day. They saw what anyone would see, a lifeless structure, unremarkable in its stillness, showing no sign of the activity happening behind its facade. No vehicles parked outside regularly. No lights turning on and off in any consistent pattern. No mail piling up. No sound. No movement that caught anyone's attention or prompted anyone to wonder. No one connected that deserted-looking house on their street to a high-priority federal kidnapping investigation focused on a residence in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson. No one had a reason to. Houses that look empty usually are. They had no idea what was hidden behind those walls, because from the outside, there was nothing to tell them there was anything to know. That is how the property functioned. Not by being hidden, by being so successfully unremarkable that the neighborhood's active memory stopped registering it as significant. And then one morning, that changed. Official vehicles surrounding the property, an elite tactical unit executing a forced entry, yellow police tape, security perimeters established by federal agents, the controlled movement of personnel and evidence out of a building that had appeared to be completely abandoned the day before. Neighbors who had walked past that facade for weeks without a second thought found themselves standing outside a federal crime scene, watching trained tactical personnel process a location whose contents were significant enough to disturb investigators, whose professional exposure is the most severe criminal evidence law enforcement encounters. What those witnesses standing outside the perimeter could not grasp was the exact nature of what the assault team had just discovered upon entering. What they could see was the response, the scale, the speed, the seriousness of a federal tactical operation descending on a building that had appeared to be nothing. The community will eventually learn the full truth. It will come through the judicial proceedings the investigation is building, step by step. Through charging documents, through the federal evidence record that formally describes what that house was concealing. Until then, what the neighbors know is what anyone outside the perimeter of the investigation knows. The federal government sent a tactical team into a house that appeared completely abandoned. And what they found inside was serious enough to disturb the professionals who found it. Let me now place this discovery inside the full arc of what the federal investigation has established. Because the raid on the abandoned house does not stand alone. It is the latest development in an investigation that has been methodically expanding its evidentiary footprint since the first week. The night of January 31st and February 1st. The 1:44 a.m. call. The camera disabled 3 minutes later. The pacemaker recording 41 minutes of distress and going silent at 2:28 a.m. The phone left on Nancy's kitchen counter. The blood on the porch. The 911 call about a woman screaming from inside a car window in the Catalina foothills. The hidden camera inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Surgical surveillance of a specific individual, installed before the night of the abduction. The tunnel. Evidence of physical infrastructure planning that pushed the origin of this crime back further than the initial crime scene suggested. 3 weeks of documented surveillance establishing Tomasso Cioni's systematic visits to the first secondary location, the 19-hour interrogation and the intelligence it generated about additional properties. And now, the abandoned house. 3 categories of deeply disturbing findings. A surveillance network that exceeded a single crime's requirements. Personal belongings in federal forensic custody. The administrative management of a site by someone who made systematic documented returns to maintain its operational readiness. That is the shape of this investigation as it now stands. It is not a search that has not found its answer. It is a case that is assembling the evidentiary architecture necessary to charge, prosecute, and convict. Every discovery has expanded what is known. Every expansion has pushed the timeline further back. Every new property, every new category of evidence, every additional finding has added weight to a case that was already significant, and made it more so. The hair evidence now in the FBI's laboratory. The blockchain trail that cannot be erased. The personal belongings currently being processed in the federal forensic lab. The documented surveillance of Cioni's movements across multiple properties. All of it is pointing toward the same moment, the moment when the investigation moves from building to charging. That moment has not yet been publicly announced. What sources have indicated is that the contents of the abandoned house have considerably strengthened the evidentiary foundation. That the categories of evidence introduced by this discovery were not previously part of the documented record. and that federal prosecutors are analyzing the totality of what has been gathered against the standard required for the charges the evidence supports. That analysis is happening right now. What the investigation still needs to confirm. Several critical questions remain officially open. Whether the personal items recovered from the abandoned house have been forensically linked to Nancy Guthrie. This is the single most significant pending determination, because if her DNA, her fingerprints, or trace evidence matching her reference profile is found on those belongings, it places her at that location after February 1st and dramatically advances the geographic scope of what the investigation can prove. Whether additional individuals, beyond those already identified, are named in the charges being prepared. The surveillance infrastructure's scope suggests this may not be limited to a single operative, and whether formal charges against Tomasso Cioni are imminent, or whether the investigation is still building toward the evidentiary threshold required for the specific charges that the evidence, in its totality, is designed to support. None of these are unanswered forever. They are unanswered right now. And the forensic laboratory working on those personal belongings is the next place those answers will come from. An empty house. That is what the neighbors saw. That is what anyone passing on the street would have seen. A lifeless structure that had stopped registering on anyone's active attention. Inside, a covert surveillance network whose sophistication exceeded the requirements of a single abduction. Personal belongings with no connection to the man the property is linked to, now in federal forensic custody, being examined to determine who they belong to and what they reveal about Nancy Guthrie's fate. And physical traces of organized, methodical, systematic activity, maintained with the same surgical precision that has characterized every other element of this crime. Disturbing. That is the word that trained tactical personnel used. Professionals whose threshold is the worst evidence law enforcement encounters. Disturbing. This investigation has pushed the origin of this crime further back at every stage. The tunnel, the first secondary site, the documentation of Cioni's movements, the 19-hour interrogation, and now, the abandoned house, whose operational existence predates every prior discovery, whose selection, acquisition, and preparation happened long before February 1st, long before this crime was detectable to anyone who was not planning it. The true scope of what was done to Nancy Guthrie has not yet been fully mapped, but it is being mapped, methodically, precisely, by a federal investigation that has shown at every stage that it is following the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how far back that requires going, or how many additional locations that requires entering. Type Nancy to keep her name in this room. Type your country and city. Type Amen for a woman who deserves to come home. For a family carrying 72 days. For the federal agents processing what they found in that house and working toward the moment when charges become public. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, or if you have seen any unusual activity near properties connected to this investigation, please contact the FBI Tucson Field Office at 520-882-7800, the Pima County Sheriff's Department tip line at 5203-514900, or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. Subscribe and turn on notifications. When the charges come, when the names are filed, you want to be in this room. We are staying on this until Nancy comes home. God bless.